The wilderness promises peace and escape, but sometimes what we find in those dark woods isn't peace at all. These 9 true camping stories will make you question every shadow between the trees and every sound in the night. We thought we had found the perfect spot. My girlfriend Sarah and I had been planning this camping trip in the Cascade Mountains for months, waiting for the summer season when the trails would be clear and the weather predictable. We were both 25, experienced hikers, and thought we knew what we were doing. The trailhead parking lot was busy when we arrived on a Friday afternoon in July, but we planned to hike deep enough into the backcountry that we'd have solitude. For miles in, we found a small clearing near a stream, far from the main trail, surrounded by towering Douglas firs that blocked out most of the sky. We set up our tent as the sun started to sink, the temperature dropping quickly once we lost direct sunlight. The forest around us was alive with normal sounds. Birds calling, the stream rushing over rocks, wind moving through the branches high above. We cooked dinner on our camp stove, hung our food bag from a tree branch to keep it away from bears, and settled in for the night feeling accomplished and peaceful. The kind of peace you only get when you're miles from cell service and civilization. Sarah fell asleep quickly, exhausted from the hike, but I stayed awake reading by flashlight for another hour. Around 11 p.m., I finally turned off my light and closed my eyes. The forest had gone quiet by then, that deep nighttime silence where even the insects seemed to stop their noise. I was just drifting off when I heard it. Footsteps. Not animal footsteps, but the distinct sound of boots crunching on the forest floor. Human steps, slow and deliberate, moving through the trees near our campsite. I opened my eyes and lay perfectly still, listening. Sarah was breathing steadily beside me, completely unaware. The footsteps continued, circling our clearing at a distance, stopping occasionally then starting again. I told myself it was another camper, someone passing through on their way to a different site. But something felt wrong. Why would someone be hiking at 11 p.m. in complete darkness through dense forest off the main trail? And why were they moving in a circle rather than in a straight line? I unzipped the tent door slightly and peered out. The moon was almost full, providing just enough light to see the clearing and the edge of the tree line. I watched for several minutes but saw nothing. The footsteps had stopped. I convinced myself I'd imagined it or misidentified some animal sound, and I zipped the door back up. But as soon as I lay back down, the footsteps started again. Closer this time, much closer. Now I could hear them clearly, moving along the perimeter of our clearing, stopping every few steps. I shook Sarah awake and whispered for her to be quiet and listen. Her eyes went wide as she heard it too. We both lay there frozen, listening to someone or something walking around our campsite in the middle of the night. The footsteps made a complete circle around our tent, close enough that we could hear twigs snapping under the weight of whoever it was. Then they stopped, right outside the tent door. We could hear breathing now, heavy and labored, like someone who had been walking for a long time. Sarah grabbed my hand and squeezed so hard her nails dug into my skin. We didn't move, didn't make a sound, barely even breathed. The presence outside the tent stayed there for what felt like an eternity but was probably only 2 or 3 minutes. Then the footsteps started again, moving away from our tent toward the tree line. I waited until I couldn't hear anything for a full 5 minutes before I worked up the courage to unzip the door and look outside. The clearing was empty. Moonlight illuminated everything clearly, and there was nobody visible. But something was different. Our food bag, which we had hung from a tree branch about 30 feet from the tent, was on the ground. Not ripped down by an animal, but placed on the ground, the rope carefully untied from the branch and coiled neatly beside it. My mouth went completely dry. An animal couldn't untie a rope. An animal couldn't coil it neatly. Someone had been in our campsite while we were in the tent. Someone with hands and intelligence. and they had taken the time to lower our food bag while we listened to them breathe outside our door. I woke Sarah and showed her. Her face went pale in the moonlight. We made a quick decision. We weren't staying here. I don't care that it was midnight. I don't care that we had to pack everything in the dark and hike 4 miles back to the car on a trail we could barely see. We threw everything into our backpacks in a frantic scramble, not even bothering to fold the tent properly, just stuffing it in. We turned on our headlamps and started hiking back the way we came, moving as fast as we could without running. The forest felt different at night. Every shadow looked like a person. Every sound made us jump. We kept our headlamps pointed at the trail directly in front of us, not wanting to see what might be watching from the trees on either side. About a mile into our hike back, Sarah grabbed my arm and pointed her light off to the side of the trail. Reflected back at us were 2 eyes, glowing in the beam about 30 feet away, too high off the ground to be a deer or a coyote. Human height. We didn't stop. We walked faster, not quite running but close to it, and the eyes followed us for maybe 200 yards before disappearing back into the darkness. Neither of us spoke. We just kept moving, our breathing loud and ragged, adrenaline pushing us forward. The hike back took half the time it had taken us to hike in, fear giving us energy we didn't know we had. We reached the parking lot at 2:30 a.m., threw our gear in the car, and drove straight back to Seattle without stopping. We didn't talk much during the drive. We were both processing what had happened, trying to make sense of it. The next day, I called the ranger station and reported what we had experienced. The ranger I spoke to listened carefully and then told me something that made my hands start shaking all over again. There had been other reports from that area over the past 3 months. Hikers camping in the backcountry had reported finding footprints around their tents in the morning, boot prints that circled their campsites multiple times. One couple had their tent partially unzipped during the night while they were sleeping, though nothing was taken. Another solo hiker reported hearing someone walking around his site for hours, never approaching directly but never leaving either. The rangers had increased patrols but hadn't found anyone. Whoever it was knew the forest well enough to avoid detection. The ranger asked me to describe exactly where we had camped, and I gave him the best description I could. He said they would send someone to check the site, and he strongly recommended we not return to that area. I assured him we had no intention of ever going back. He also mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that there had been a string of burglaries at trailhead parking lots in that area. Cars broken into, gear stolen. They suspected someone was living in the forest illegally, possibly multiple people, using the backcountry as a base and emerging to steal from hikers. But that didn't explain what we experienced. A thief would have taken our food bag and run. They wouldn't have untied it carefully and placed it on the ground. They wouldn't have spent time circling our tent, standing outside our door breathing loud enough for us to hear. That wasn't theft. That was something else. That was someone playing with us, letting us know they were there, establishing dominance in their territory. About a month later, I got a call from a detective with the county sheriff's office. They had caught someone living in the backcountry near where we had camped. A man in his late 40s with a long criminal history including assault and stalking. He had built a small shelter about 2 miles from where we had set up our tent, hidden so well that hikers passed within 50 feet of it without noticing. When they searched his shelter, they found items stolen from campers: camping equipment, clothing, food, and photographs. Dozens of photographs that he had apparently taken of hikers and campers without their knowledge. Some of the photos were taken at night using a camera with night vision, showing people sleeping in their tents. The detective asked me to come look at the photos to see if Sarah and I were among them. I drove to the sheriff's office and spent an hour looking through printed images that made me feel sick. There we were, multiple photos of our tent from different angles, taken that night. One showed Sarah and me sitting by our camp stove eating dinner, obviously unaware we were being photographed. Another showed the side of our tent glowing from my flashlight as I read. And the one that still gives me nightmares, showed the outline of our bodies through the tent fabric as we slept, taken from maybe 10 feet away. The detective said the man had been stalking hikers for at least 6 months, possibly longer. He would find isolated campsites, watch the occupants for hours, sometimes approach their tents in the night and stand outside listening to them sleep. He collected photographs like trophies. In all that time, he had never physically harmed anyone, but the detective believed he was escalating. That eventually watching wouldn't be enough. They charged him with multiple crimes: stalking, burglary, trespassing, and several others I can't remember. He was convicted and sentenced to 8 years in prison. The detective called me after the sentencing and said I should feel good about coming forward, that our report had helped establish the pattern of behavior that secured the conviction. But I don't feel good. I feel violated and terrified and angry. That man stood outside our tent in the middle of the night, close enough to touch the fabric, close enough to reach through and grab us if he wanted. He untied our food bag while we were awake and aware, demonstrating his control, his ability to access our space whenever he chose. And we had no idea he had been photographing us for who knows how long before that night. Sarah and I still go camping, but never in backcountry sites anymore. We only stay in developed campgrounds with rangers on duty and other campers nearby. We bring extra locks for our tent zippers, even though we know locks won't stop someone determined to get in. And every night, before we go to sleep, we do a perimeter check of our campsite looking for anything out of place, any sign that someone has been watching. Because now we know that sometimes the most dangerous thing in the woods isn't the wildlife. It's the other humans, the ones who have decided that the rules of civilization don't apply to them anymore, who watch from the shadows and take what they want and only stop when they're caught. We were lucky. We trusted our instincts and left when something felt wrong. But I think about that night constantly, about what might have happened if we had stayed, if we had gone back to sleep and ignored the warning signs. And I wonder how many other people are out there right now, sleeping in their tents in the backcountry, unaware that someone is standing just outside in the darkness, watching them breathe. Story 2: The Abandoned Campsite. My friends Tyler and Marcus convinced me to go camping in the Uhori National Forest in North Carolina over Memorial Day weekend. I was 28, recently divorced, and needed to get out of my apartment and do something that didn't involve sitting alone feeling sorry for myself. We planned to hike about 3 miles in from the trailhead and set up camp near Budden Lake, spend 2 nights under the stars, do some fishing, drink some beer, and forget about our problems for a while. The first day went exactly as planned. We hiked in on a beautiful Saturday morning, found a perfect spot about 50 yards from the lake shore with a small fire ring that previous campers had built, and set up our 3 tents in a triangle around the fire pit. The weather was perfect, low 70s and sunny, and the lake was calm and clear. We spent the afternoon swimming, fishing without much luck, and bullshitting about work and relationships and all the usual stuff guys talk about when they're trying to avoid real emotional conversations. As the sun started to set, Tyler spotted something through the trees about a 1/4 mile down the shoreline. Another campsite, but it looked abandoned. We could see a tent still standing, but it had that collapsed, weathered look of something that had been there a long time. Our curiosity got the better of us, and we decided to hike over and check it out. Maybe there was gear left behind that we could use, or at minimum it would be interesting to see. The hike along the shore was harder than it looked. Lots of rocks and fallen trees to navigate around. But we reached the site just as the light was starting to fade. The tent was a disaster. It was a cheap dome tent, probably from Walmart, and one side had completely collapsed. The fabric was sun-faded and ripped in several places, and there was a thick layer of pine needles and debris piled on top of it. Next to the tent was a fire ring, but it was full of old ashes that looked like they'd been rained on multiple times. This site hadn't been used in weeks, maybe months. Marcus pulled back the tent flap and looked inside. He immediately recoiled and said, "Oh fuck! Something died in there." The smell hit us a second later, that unmistakable rot smell of decomposing organic matter. We assumed it was a dead animal, maybe a raccoon or possum that had crawled in there to die. But Tyler, always the brave one or the stupid one depending on your perspective, got closer and shined his flashlight inside. There was a sleeping bag in the tent, laid out flat like someone had been sleeping in it. And there were clothes scattered around like someone had been living there. A pair of boots sat just inside the entrance. But no body, animal or human. Whatever had died in there wasn't visible, and the smell was so overwhelming that none of us wanted to investigate further. We backed away from the tent, and that's when Tyler noticed something else. On a tree about 10 feet from the tent, someone had carved words into the bark. Deep, jagged letters that looked like they'd been made with a knife. The message said, "They're coming back tonight." Below it, someone had carved what looked like a date, but it was partially obscured by tree sap and we couldn't make it out clearly. The letters were old. The wounds in the tree bark had started to heal over, suggesting it had been carved weeks or even months ago. The three of us stood there in the fading light, staring at that message, and suddenly the abandoned campsite felt a lot less interesting and a lot more ominous. Who were they? Who carved this message? Was it the person who had been camping here or someone else? And why did they leave their tent and all their gear behind? Marcus said we should report it to the rangers, that there might be a missing person situation. Tyler agreed, but it was getting dark fast, and our campsite was a quarter-mile away through rough terrain. We decided we'd hike back to our site, spend the night, and report it in the morning when we hiked out. In retrospect, that was a mistake. We should have left immediately. We made it back to our campsite just as the last light disappeared from the sky. We built a fire and tried to act normal, but the abandoned tent and that carved message had put all of us on edge. We couldn't stop talking about it, coming up with theories. Maybe it was just some hiker who got spooked and left in a hurry. Maybe it was a prank, someone trying to scare people. Maybe the person got injured and had to be rescued, and the tent had been left behind accidentally. Around 10 p.m., we heard voices. Not near our campsite, but in the distance, back toward the abandoned site we had found. Multiple people, men from the sound of it, talking loud enough that we could hear them but not clear enough to make out words. Then we saw lights, flashlights moving through the trees along the shoreline, heading in the direction of that abandoned tent. Tyler stood up and said maybe we should go check it out, see if it was rangers or park employees investigating the site. But something about the way those lights were moving, erratic and uncoordinated, and something about the tone of the voices, aggressive and harsh, made me say absolutely not. We should stay at our campsite, keep quiet, and let whoever it was do their thing. Marcus agreed with me. We sat by our fire, not talking anymore, just watching those lights in the distance. They stayed in the area of the abandoned campsite for maybe 20 minutes. We could hear occasional shouts, the sound of something heavy being dragged, metallic clanging like gear being moved. Then the lights started moving again, but not away from the area. They were coming toward us, following the shoreline, heading directly for our campsite. I stood up and kicked dirt on our fire, dousing it quickly. Tyler and Marcus looked at me like I was crazy, but then they saw how close the lights were getting and they understood. We grabbed our flashlights but didn't turn them on, and we moved away from our tents into the tree line where we could watch our campsite without being visible. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The lights reached our campsite within 5 minutes. There were 4 of them, 4 men carrying heavy-duty flashlights and what looked like backpacks. They walked right into our camp and started looking around, shining lights on our tents, kicking at our gear that we'd left outside. One of them opened the cooler we'd brought and started going through it, pulling out our food and beer. Another one unzipped Tyler's tent and crawled inside. We were about 30 feet away, hidden behind trees, watching these men ransack our campsite. I could see them clearly in the glow of their flashlights. They were all wearing dark clothing, faces partially covered with bandanas or scarves. One of them had a machete hanging from his belt. Another had what looked like a handgun tucked into his waistband. The one going through our cooler said something about rich weekend campers and how they always brought the good stuff. The one who had been in Tyler's tent came out holding Tyler's sleeping bag and a portable speaker. They were looting our site, taking whatever they wanted. But then one of them, the biggest one with the machete, said something that made my blood freeze. He said, "Where are they? Their shit is here, but they're not in the tents." Another one responded, "Probably went to take a piss or something. They'll come back. We wait." And then they turned off their flashlights and sat down around our dead fire, waiting in the darkness for us to return. We had walked right into a trap. These people had been using that abandoned campsite as bait, watching for other campers to find it and get curious. And when those campers went back to their own site, these men would follow and rob them. Or worse, the three of us stayed hidden in the trees, barely breathing, trying to figure out what to do. We couldn't get to our tents to grab our gear without walking right past these men. We couldn't hike out because we'd have to cross through our campsite to reach the trail. We were trapped, and all we could do was wait and hope they eventually gave up and left. 20 minutes passed. 30. The men sat there in silence, occasionally whispering to each other, but mostly just waiting. Patient, like they'd done this before and knew exactly how it worked. Campers would come back eventually, they always did, and when they walked into camp thinking everything was fine, they'd be ambushed. Around midnight, one of them stood up and said they should check the woods nearby, that maybe we saw them coming and hid. The others agreed. They spread out and started walking through the forest with their flashlights on, searching systematically. They were coming right toward where we were hiding. We had seconds to make a decision. Run deeper into the woods and risk making noise and being chased, or stay perfectly still and hope they didn't see us. Tyler made the choice for us. He took off running, crashing through the underbrush. The flashlights immediately swung toward the sound, and all four men started chasing him, shouting at him to stop. Marcus grabbed my arm and pulled me in the opposite direction. We ran as quietly as we could, parallel to the lake shore, trying to put distance between us and our campsite. Behind us, we could hear Tyler still running, the men still chasing, voices echoing through the forest. We ran for maybe 10 minutes before we stopped, our lungs burning, and listened. Everything had gone quiet. No more voices, no more crashing through brush. Nothing. We waited, hidden behind a fallen log, for what felt like hours but was probably 20 minutes. Then we heard it. Footsteps. Someone walking slowly through the woods, sweeping a flashlight back and forth. Searching. We pressed ourselves flat against the ground and didn't move. The footsteps came within maybe 20 feet of us, the flashlight beam passing just over our heads, and then continued on. We stayed there until we saw the first light of dawn starting to brighten the sky. As soon as we had enough light to see, we started moving toward where we thought the main trail was. We didn't try to go back to our campsite, didn't try to find Tyler, just focused on getting to the trail and getting out of the forest. It took us almost 3 hours of stumbling through unfamiliar terrain before we found the trail, and another 2 hours to hike back to the parking lot where we'd left Marcus's truck. Tyler's car was still there, which meant he hadn't made it out yet. We immediately called 911 and reported everything that had happened. Forest rangers and county sheriff deputies responded, and we led them back to our campsite. Our tents were still there, but everything else was gone. All our food, our cooler, our gear, even our sleeping bags. The abandoned campsite we'd found earlier was completely cleared out too. The tent that had been there was gone. The fire ring had been scattered. Even the tree with the carved message had been cut down. It was like someone had systematically erased all evidence. They found Tyler around noon. He had run almost 2 miles before he collapsed from exhaustion and hid under a pile of brush. He heard the men searching for him for over an hour before they gave up. He stayed hidden until sunrise, then made his way to the lake and followed the shoreline until he found a different trail out. He was scratched up, exhausted, dehydrated, but alive. The investigation didn't turn up much. The rangers said there had been reports of theft from campsites in that area over the past year, but nothing as aggressive as what we experienced. They believed it was a group of people living in the forest illegally, possibly cooking meth or growing marijuana deeper in the backcountry, using robbery to supplement their income. The abandoned campsite was likely a lure they set up deliberately. Make it look creepy enough that curious campers would investigate, but leave enough clues to make them go back to their own site and discuss it. Then follow them and rob them when they were most vulnerable. The carved message on the tree was probably meant to do exactly what it did. Plant a seed of fear that would make the victims easier to handle when the time came. Scared people don't fight back as effectively. We were supposed to be frightened and off balance, and we were. It almost worked perfectly. If Tyler hadn't run when he did, if we'd stayed hidden just a few seconds longer, those men would have found us. And given that at least 2 of them were armed, I don't think they would have been content with just robbing us. No one was ever caught. The forest is too big, too easy to disappear into. The rangers increased patrols and closed several backcountry campsites temporarily, but eventually everything went back to normal. Tyler, Marcus, and I haven't been camping together since. We tried once about a year later, but none of us could relax. Every sound put us on edge. Every shadow looked like someone watching. We packed up after one night and went home. I still have nightmares about that abandoned tent and the message carved into the tree. They're coming back tonight. It was true. They did come back, and we were supposed to be there waiting for them, unaware and unprepared. We got lucky because we were cautious, because we trusted our instincts when something felt wrong. But luck runs out eventually, and somewhere in the Uhori National Forest, I believe those men are still there, still setting up their traps, still waiting for the next group of campers to find their bait and take it. I hope whoever finds it next is smarter than we were. I hope they run as soon as they see that message and don't look back. Story 3: The Woman by the Lake. Lake Wenatchee in Washington State is beautiful in late August, when the summer crowds have thinned but the weather is still warm. My sister Kelly and I decided to do a girls' camping trip, just the 2 of us, to celebrate her getting promoted at work. We were both in our early 30s, both experienced with camping and hiking, and we thought a few days by the lake would be perfect for some sister bonding time. We arrived on a Thursday afternoon and set up our tent at a walk-in campsite that required a 1/4-mile hike from the parking area. The site was somewhat isolated from the main campground, tucked back in the trees with a narrow trail leading down to the lake shore. We liked the privacy and the quiet. The nearest occupied campsite was at least 100 yards away, and we could barely hear other campers even when they were being loud. The first night was perfect. We built a fire, cooked dinner, drank wine from a box, and talked about everything from our childhoods to our current relationship problems. The kind of deep conversation you can only have with someone who's known you your entire life. We went to sleep around 11 p.m. feeling content and peaceful, the kind of sleep you get when you're exhausted from fresh air and physical activity. I woke up around 3 a.m. because I needed to pee. The tent was dark and Kelly was snoring softly beside me. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent as quietly as I could, not wanting to wake her. The campsite was silent except for the distant sound of the lake lapping against the shore. I walked about 30 feet from the tent to do my business behind a tree, and that's when I saw her. A woman was standing at the edge of our campsite, right where the tree line met the clearing. She was perfectly still, facing toward our tent. I couldn't see her face clearly because she was backlit by moonlight, but I could see her silhouette. Long hair, thin frame, wearing what looked like a dress or a long nightgown, just standing there motionless in the middle of the night. My first instinct was to call out and ask if she needed help, but something stopped me. The way she was standing, so perfectly still, felt wrong. Normal people don't stand like that. They shift their weight, move their head, do something. This woman looked like a statue. I finished quickly and started backing toward the tent, keeping my eyes on her. She didn't move, didn't acknowledge me at all. I climbed back into the tent and zipped it shut, my heart racing. I shook Kelly awake and whispered that there was someone outside. She groggily asked what I was talking about, and I told her about the woman standing at the edge of our campsite. Kelly grabbed her flashlight and unzipped the tent door, shining her light where I had indicated. The spot was empty. No woman, no one there at all. Kelly looked at me like I was crazy and said I probably saw a shadow or a tree stump, and my tired brain interpreted it as a person. She went back to sleep, but I knew what I had seen. That was a person, not a shadow. I lay awake for the next hour, listening, but heard nothing unusual. Eventually, exhaustion overtook my anxiety and I fell back asleep. The next morning, Kelly and I walked around the campsite looking for any sign that someone had been there during the night. We found footprints, small bare footprints in the soft dirt, right where I had seen the woman standing. The prints led from the direction of the lake, stopped at our campsite, then led back toward the lake and disappeared into the rocky shore area where they wouldn't leave marks. Kelly's attitude changed immediately. Someone had been standing there watching our tent in the middle of the night, and they had been barefoot. That detail bothered us both. Who walks through the forest barefoot at 3 a.m.? Kelly wanted to report it to the camp host, but I convinced her to let it go. The person hadn't approached our tent, hadn't tried to interact with us. Maybe they were just a weird fellow camper who couldn't sleep and was going for a walk. We decided to be more alert but not let it ruin our trip. That day we spent hours at the lake, swimming and reading on the shore. We saw other families and groups of friends doing the same. Everything felt normal and safe. As the sun started to set, we headed back to our campsite and cooked dinner. Kelly made a joke about our midnight visitor, calling her the lake ghost, and we laughed about it. The fear from the previous night seemed silly in the bright evening light. We went to bed around 10 p.m., both of us tired from a full day in the sun. This time we both woke up at the same time, around 2:30 a.m., not because of a noise but because of a smell, something acrid and chemical like gasoline or lighter fluid, but with an organic rot smell mixed in. It was strong enough to wake us both from deep sleep. Kelly grabbed her flashlight and we unzipped the tent. The woman was there again, but this time she was closer, maybe 10 feet from our tent, and she was facing us directly. In the beam of Kelly's flashlight, I could see her clearly for the first time. She was thin, emaciated really, with long tangled hair that hung past her shoulders. Her dress or nightgown was filthy and torn, but her face, God, her face. Her eyes were sunken deep in her skull. Her skin was grayish and covered in what looked like sores or dirt, and her mouth was hanging open slightly. She looked like she was dying or already dead. Kelly screamed. I've never heard my sister scream like that. A pure sound of terror. The woman didn't react to the scream or the flashlight. She just stood there, swaying slightly, her dead eyes fixed on us. Then she raised one arm slowly and pointed at our tent. Her mouth moved like she was trying to speak, but no sound came out. Just that slow, deliberate pointing gesture. Kelly and I scrambled out of the tent and ran. We didn't grab our gear, didn't think about our phones or car keys, just ran in pure panic toward the main campground where there were other people and lights. We were both screaming as we ran, and I could hear people emerging from their tents asking what was wrong. We reached the camp host's trailer and pounded on the door, both of us hysterical, trying to explain what we'd seen. The camp host, a man in his 60s named Douglas, took us seriously even though we sounded insane. He grabbed a large flashlight and a radio and headed toward our campsite with two other male campers who had heard the commotion and volunteered to help. He told us to stay at his trailer with his wife. We sat there shaking, wrapped in blankets his wife gave us, waiting for them to come back. They returned about 30 minutes later. Douglas said they found our tent exactly as we'd left it, door hanging open. They searched the entire area with flashlights and found nothing. No woman, no footprints, no sign anyone had been there. But he said something in his expression told me he believed us, or at least believed we had seen something. His wife made us coffee and we sat in their trailer the rest of the night, too afraid to go back to our tent. At sunrise, Douglas and his wife walked back to our campsite with us so we could pack our things. In the daylight, everything looked normal. Our tent, our gear, all undisturbed. We packed as quickly as we could, both of us constantly looking around, expecting to see the woman standing in the trees watching us. As we were loading the last of our things, Douglas pulled me aside. He said he needed to tell me something. 3 years ago, a woman had drowned in the lake. She had been camping alone, struggling with drug addiction and mental health issues according to her family. One night, she walked into the lake and never came out. Her body was found a week later, badly decomposed from the warm August water. Ever since then, other campers had reported seeing a woman matching that description near the lake at night, standing in campsites, watching from the tree line, sometimes walking along the shore. Douglas said most people dismissed it as grief-induced hallucinations from her family members who still camped there, or tricks of light and shadow. But he believed the reports were real. Too many people had seen the same thing, described the same details, for it to be coincidence or imagination. He showed me a photo on his phone. It was an obituary picture of the woman who had drowned. My legs almost gave out. It was her. The same thin face, the same long hair, the same sunken eyes. The woman who had been standing outside our tent, pointing at us, trying to speak. Kelly looked at the photo and started crying. We thanked Douglas and got in our car, and I drove us straight home, a 4-hour drive that we did in complete silence. I don't know what we saw at Lake Wenatchee. I don't know if I believe in ghosts or spirits, or if there's some rational explanation I can't think of. All I know is that something was standing outside our tent for 2 nights in a row, and it looked exactly like a woman who had died in that lake 3 years prior. And the smell that woke us up the second night, that chemical rot smell, matched descriptions of how bodies smell when they've been in water for an extended period. Kelly and I have talked about it many times since then, trying to make sense of it. She's convinced it was a ghost, a spirit trapped at the location of her death, trying to communicate something to the living. I'm less certain about the supernatural explanation, but I can't come up with a better one. What I am certain of is that we'll never camp at Lake Wenatchee again, and the memory of that figure pointing at our tent with her dead eyes and silent mouth will haunt me for the rest of my life. Story 4. The Stalker in the Woods. My boyfriend Jake and I planned a weekend camping trip in the Monongahela National Forest in West Virginia for early October, hoping to catch the fall foliage at its peak. We were both 26, both from Ohio, and we'd been dating for about 8 months. This was our first camping trip together, and I was excited to spend some quality time with him away from the distractions of our normal life. We picked a remote campsite that required a 3-mile hike from the nearest road, figuring the isolation would be romantic and peaceful. The hike in was beautiful, leaves turning brilliant shades of red and orange, the air crisp and cool but not too cold. We reached our site around 3 p.m. on a Saturday and set up our tent in a small clearing surrounded by dense forest. The site had obviously been used before. There was a fire ring made of stones and some logs arranged around it for seating. We were completely alone. No other campers visible or audible in any direction. Exactly what we wanted. We spent the afternoon gathering firewood and exploring the area around our campsite. About a quarter-mile away, we found the remnants of an old structure, maybe a hunting cabin or a shelter, mostly collapsed but with a few walls still partially standing. Jake took some photos of it, said it would make good content for his Instagram. We poked around the ruins for a few minutes but didn't find anything interesting, just some old rusted tools and rotting wood. As the sun started to set, we headed back to our site to cook dinner. That's when I first felt like we were being watched. It was nothing concrete, just a feeling, that prickling sensation on the back of your neck that tells you someone is looking at you. I mentioned it to Jake and he laughed, said I was being paranoid, that we were miles from civilization and there was nobody out here but us. I tried to shake it off and focus on enjoying the evening. We built a fire and cooked hot dogs and beans, drinking beer and talking about plans for the future. As it got darker, the forest around us seemed to close in. The firelight only illuminated a small circle, maybe 15 feet in radius, and beyond that was complete darkness. Every sound seemed amplified, branches cracking, leaves rustling, the occasional animal call. Jake thought it was atmospheric and cool. I found it increasingly unnerving. Around 9 p.m., Jake said he heard something moving through the brush nearby. He grabbed his flashlight and shined it into the forest in the direction of the sound. The beam caught two eyes reflecting back, maybe 50 feet away, too high off the ground to be a deer or a dog. Human height. Jake called out, "Hello?" but got no response. The eyes disappeared. Either the person stepped behind a tree or turned away. Jake was suddenly much less amused. He stood up and shined his light all around our campsite, but saw nothing else. We decided to turn in for the night, feeling unsettled. Jake said it was probably just another hiker or camper passing through the area, but his voice had lost its confidence. We brushed our teeth, put our food in a bear bag and hung it from a tree, and climbed into our tent. Jake had brought a small knife which he normally used for camp chores, and he kept it within reach beside his sleeping bag. That should have been my first clue that he was more worried than he was letting on. Couldn't sleep. The feeling of being watched had only intensified, and now every little sound outside the tent made my heart race. Around midnight, I heard footsteps. Clear, distinct human footsteps walking around our campsite. Not trying to be quiet, just walking casually like someone on an evening stroll. Jake heard them too. He sat up and whispered, "Who's out there?" No answer. The footsteps continued, circling our tent slowly. Jake unzipped the tent door and looked out. Our fire had died down to just coals, providing barely any light. He shined his flashlight around the clearing and saw nothing. But the moment he turned the light off, the footsteps started again. He turned it back on, they stopped. Off they started. It was like whoever was out there was playing with us, testing how we would react. Jake stepped out of the tent, flashlight in one hand and knife in the other, and told me to stay inside. I heard him walking around the campsite, calling out that he knew someone was there and they needed to identify themselves or leave. He sounded angry more than scared, which was typical Jake, responding to fear with aggression. After about 5 minutes, he came back to the tent and said he couldn't find anyone. But he had found something else. Footprints in the soft dirt around our tent, fresh prints from boots, circling our tent multiple times. We both knew we weren't imagining things anymore. Someone had been walking around our tent while we were inside, deliberately trying to frighten us. Jake said we should pack up and leave, hike back to the car even though it was midnight and we'd be navigating 3 miles of forest trail in the dark. I agreed immediately. Neither of us wanted to spend another minute at that campsite. We started packing our gear by flashlight, moving quickly, throwing things into our backpacks without bothering to organize them properly. As we were taking down the tent, I heard something that made me freeze. Whistling. Someone in the forest nearby was whistling a tune, cheerful and melodic, completely at odds with the situation. The whistling circled around us, moving through the trees, sometimes close, sometimes far away, but always there, always watching. Jake was freaking out now, all his bravado gone. He kept shining his light toward the whistling but never caught sight of whoever was making the sound. We finished packing in record time and started heading toward the trail that would lead us out. The whistling followed us. For the entire 3-mile hike back to our car, someone walked parallel to us through the forest, just out of sight, whistling that same cheerful tune. Occasionally we would see a flashlight beam in the trees, brief flashes that confirmed someone was definitely following us. The hike took us almost 2 hours, stumbling along the trail with our flashlights, tripping over roots and rocks, driven by pure fear. The entire time, the whistling continued. Sometimes it would stop for a few minutes and we'd think maybe they had given up, but then it would start again, always behind us, always keeping pace. When we finally reached our car at the trailhead parking lot, we threw our gear in the trunk and jumped inside, locking the doors immediately. As Jake started the engine, I looked back toward the trail entrance. A figure stepped out of the forest into the parking lot lights. A man, maybe in his 40s, wearing hunting camouflage and carrying a flashlight. He stopped at the edge of the lot and just stood there watching us. He wasn't whistling anymore. He was just watching, with this blank expression on his face that was somehow more terrifying than if he had been angry or aggressive. He raised one hand in a slow wave as we drove away. We reported it to the Forest Service and the local police the next day. They took a statement but said without more specific information about who the person was or where exactly they were, there wasn't much they could do. They said there had been occasional reports of people being harassed by locals in that area. People who resented outsiders camping on their land even though it was public forest. Most of the incidents were just intimidation tactics trying to scare campers away. Nobody had been physically harmed, but the harassment was escalating over time. The ranger we spoke with suggested we might have encountered someone with mental health issues living in the forest, or possibly someone guarding an illegal marijuana grow operation who saw us as a threat. Either way, he said we were smart to leave when we did. He told us about another couple who had a similar experience a few months prior, someone following them through the woods at night, and they had decided to stay at their campsite thinking it would blow over. During the night, someone cut their tent open while they were sleeping. They woke up to a knife slicing through the fabric inches from their faces. They ran and weren't hurt, but the psychological trauma was severe. Jake and I broke up about a month after that trip. He blamed me for suggesting we camp in such a remote location, even though it had been his idea originally. I think the truth is that we both felt vulnerable and helpless that night, and neither of us dealt with it well. We couldn't look at each other without being reminded of that fear, that whistling in the dark, that figure watching us from the forest. The relationship couldn't survive it. I haven't been camping since. I tried once, about a year later, with some girlfriends at a developed campground with bathrooms and showers and camp hosts. But that first night, as the sun was setting and the shadows grew longer, I started hearing whistling in my head. Not real whistling, just the memory of it. I had a full panic attack and had to leave. My friends were understanding, but I could tell they thought I was being dramatic. They didn't understand what it felt like to be hunted, to know someone was following you through dark woods, to see them step into the light and wave goodbye like they just shared a pleasant evening with you. I still have nightmares about that night in Monongahela. In the dreams, Jake and I don't make it back to the car. The whistling gets closer and closer until it's right behind us. And when I turn around, there's a face inches from mine, grinning in the flashlight beam. I always wake up before I see who it is, my heart racing, covered in sweat. And for just a moment, in that confused space between sleeping and waking, I can still hear the whistling, cheerful and melodic, echoing through the darkness. Story 5: The Wrong Trail. My dad and I used to go on annual camping trips every summer, just the two of us, a tradition we'd maintained since I was 10 years old. By the time I was 19, we'd camped in dozens of state and national parks across the country. That summer, we decided to try the Gila Wilderness in New Mexico, a remote area known for its hot springs and challenging terrain. We planned a 3-day backpacking loop that would take us through some of the most isolated parts of the wilderness. The first day went smoothly. We hiked about 8 miles and set up camp near a small creek. My dad, always the cautious one, triple-checked his GPS and map to make sure we were on the right trail. Everything looked good. We spent the evening fishing and talking about my plans for college, which was starting in a few months. It was peaceful and relaxing, exactly what we both needed. The second day started well enough. We broke camp early and started hiking by 7 a.m., hoping to cover 10 miles and reach the hot springs by afternoon. The trail was poorly marked, just occasional cairns and faint paths worn into the dirt. My dad kept checking his GPS every 20 minutes or so, making sure we were still on course. Around noon, we stopped for lunch and he realized something was wrong. According to the GPS, we had deviated from the trail about 2 miles back. We were heading in completely the wrong direction. My dad pulled out the paper map and tried to figure out where we'd gone wrong. He pinpointed what he thought was our location and plotted a route to get back to the main trail. It would add about 3 miles to our day, but we had enough daylight to manage it. We packed up and started hiking in what we believed was the correct direction. But after an hour of walking, nothing looked familiar. The terrain didn't match what the map showed. My dad's GPS started acting strange, the reading jumping around, the battery draining unusually fast even though it had been fully charged that morning. We kept hiking, hoping to hit something recognizable, but the landscape just got more rugged and confusing. We were in a narrow canyon with steep walls on either side, following what looked like an old game trail. My dad finally admitted we were lost. Not just off-trail, but genuinely lost with no clear idea of where we were or how to get back to our planned route. He said we should stop, set up camp, and in the morning with fresh minds and full daylight we'd be able to navigate out. We found a relatively flat area and set up the tent. Neither of us was particularly worried yet. We had food and water for several more days, we had emergency supplies, and we knew generally what direction to go to eventually hit a road or ranger station. It was frustrating and embarrassing, but not dangerous. My dad made jokes about getting old and losing his navigation skills, trying to keep the mood light. As we were setting up the tent, I noticed something strange. On a rock face about 20 feet away, someone had spray-painted words in red. Big, jagged letters that said, "Turn back." Below it was an arrow pointing in the direction we had come from. My dad walked over to examine it and found more spray paint nearby. More warnings. Not safe. Keep out. They watch. The paint looked relatively fresh, probably done within the past few months. My dad said it was probably teenagers or vandals, nothing to worry about. But I could tell he was uneasy. We weren't on public hiking trails anymore. We had somehow wandered into an area where someone felt the need to warn people away. The question was why? What was here that someone wanted to keep secret or protect? We decided to ignore the warnings and camp there for the night anyway. We didn't have a lot of options, and it was getting dark. We'd figure out a new route in the morning. We cooked dinner and tried to act normal, but both of us kept glancing at those spray-painted warnings, the red letters seeming to glow in our firelight. Around 10 p.m. we heard vehicles. Not just one, but several, the sound of engines echoing through the canyon. We could see lights in the distance, headlights moving along what must have been some kind of road or trail that we hadn't noticed. My dad stood up and was about to grab his flashlight to signal for help when I grabbed his arm. Something about the way those vehicles were moving, spread out in a pattern, engines revving, didn't seem like rangers or rescue personnel. It seemed like people searching for something, or someone. We turned off our camp lantern and sat in darkness, watching the lights move through the canyon. They were getting closer, heading in our general direction. My dad whispered that we should hide, that something about this felt wrong. We grabbed our most essential supplies, our water bottles, flashlights, and the emergency beacon my dad always carried, and moved away from our tent into the rocky area nearby. We found a spot behind some large boulders where we could watch our campsite without being visible. The vehicles reached our camp within 20 minutes. 3 ATVs with bright LED light bars. So bright they lit up the entire area like daylight. 4 men got off the ATVs and started looking around our campsite. They weren't Forest Service, weren't wearing any official uniforms or identification. They wore regular clothes, jeans and jackets, but they all had rifles slung over their shoulders. They went through our tent, pulled out our gear, looked through everything. One of them said something in Spanish that I couldn't understand, and another one responded. They were looking for us, specifically looking for the people who belonged to this camp. My dad and I barely breathed, watching from our hiding spot about 50 feet away. One of the men pulled out a radio and spoke into it, reporting what they had found. The response was garbled, but I caught a few words. Find them, can't leave, secure the area. This wasn't a simple case of angry locals. This was organized, coordinated, and we were the target. The men spread out and started searching the area, shining powerful flashlights into the rocks and bushes. My dad grabbed the emergency beacon and activated it, a device that would send our location to rescue services via satellite. It would take time for help to arrive, maybe hours, but it was our best option. We stayed hidden, moving slowly and carefully whenever the searchers' lights were pointing away from us, trying to put more distance between us and the campsite. For 2 hours, those men searched for us. Occasionally, we'd hear them calling out in English, saying they knew we were out there, that we needed to come out and talk. They said we'd wandered into a restricted area by accident and they just wanted to escort us out safely. But the rifles and the aggression in their movements told a different story. Whatever was in this canyon that needed those spray-painted warnings, we'd stumbled into it, and these people couldn't allow us to leave and tell anyone what we'd seen. Around 1 a.m. we heard a helicopter. A real one, not theirs. The sound of rotor blades echoing through the canyon. The men immediately packed up and rode their ATVs away at high speed, their lights disappearing into the darkness. The helicopter circled overhead with a spotlight, searching for us. My dad stood up and used his flashlight to signal our location. The helicopter hovered nearby and a voice over a loudspeaker told us to stay where we were, that help was coming. A rescue team reached us on foot about an hour later, Forest Service rangers with night vision equipment and weapons of their own. They escorted us out of the canyon and to a ranger station where we gave detailed statements to what turned out to be DEA agents and federal law enforcement. We learned that we'd accidentally hiked into an area used by a drug trafficking operation. The canyon was part of a route for smuggling drugs from Mexico, and there were warehouses and processing facilities hidden in the remote wilderness that we could have stumbled across if we'd kept walking. The operation had lookouts posted who spotted us when we first entered the area. The spray-painted warnings were meant to discourage hikers, but if someone didn't turn back, armed guards would find them and either scare them away or, in some cases, people disappeared. The agents said we were incredibly lucky. Lucky that we got lost in a way that made us set up camp before finding the main facilities. Lucky that my dad had an emergency beacon. Lucky that we thought to hide instead of approaching the vehicles. 3 people had gone missing in that area over the past 2 years. Hikers who were never found. The assumption was they'd gotten lost and died of exposure or injuries, but after our encounter, the agents believed they'd walked into the trafficking operation and been killed to protect it. Our emergency beacon triggered a raid that shut down the operation, but by the time law enforcement secured the area, everyone involved had fled. No arrests were made. My dad and I were airlifted out the next morning. Our gear, everything we'd left at that campsite, was collected as evidence and we never got it back. The Gila Wilderness is beautiful and I'm sure 99% of it is perfectly safe, but we'll never go back. Every time I think about camping now, I remember those men with rifles searching for us in the dark, and I wonder what would have happened if we hadn't hidden. If we'd stayed at our tent and confronted them like reasonable people would. I think the answer is obvious, and it's not an answer that includes us making it home alive. Story 6. The Screaming in the Night. My college roommate Ben and I decided to go camping in the Cherokee National Forest in Tennessee during our spring break. We were both 20, broke students looking for a cheap way to spend our week off. We threw our gear in Ben's beat-up Toyota and drove 5 hours to the forest, planning to camp for 4 days at various spots throughout the area. The first 2 days were great. Perfect weather, beautiful scenery, minimal bugs. We hiked during the days and sat around campfires at night, drinking cheap whiskey and talking about life. On the 3rd night, we set up camp at a somewhat isolated site about a mile off the main campground area. We liked the privacy and the challenge of a less developed location. Around midnight, we were sitting by the fire when we heard the first scream. It was distant, maybe a half-mile away, but loud enough to make us both jump. It sounded like a woman screaming in absolute terror, a high-pitched shriek that lasted several seconds before cutting off abruptly. Ben and I looked at each other, both of us frozen. He said it was probably a fox or a bobcat, animals that could make sounds eerily similar to human screaming. We sat in tense silence for a few minutes, listening. Then it happened again. Another scream, closer this time, and there was no mistaking it for an animal. This was human. This was a person in distress, screaming for help or screaming in pain. My first instinct was to grab a flashlight and go investigate, but Ben grabbed my arm and said absolutely not. If someone was hurt, we should call for help, not go stumbling through the dark forest ourselves. We had limited cell service, only 1 bar, but it was enough to call 911. I reported what we'd heard, gave our location as best as I could describe it, and the dispatcher said they'd send rangers to investigate. She told us to stay at our campsite and wait for them to arrive. We kept our fire going and sat back to back, scanning the trees around us with our flashlights. The screaming continued. Every 10 or 15 minutes, another scream would pierce through the night, sometimes from the same direction, sometimes from a completely different area of the forest. It was like whatever was making that sound was moving around us in a circle, getting closer with each scream. After the 5th or 6th scream, Ben said something that made my skin crawl. He said it sounded like the same scream every time. Exactly the same pitch, exactly the same length, like a recording being played rather than a real person in real distress. We tested his theory. When the next scream came, we both focused on listening carefully. He was right. It was identical to the previous screams. Not the variations you'd expect from a human in genuine panic or pain. Same pitch, same duration, same pattern of sound. Then we heard something else between the screams. Laughter. Low, male laughter coming from the direction of the most recent scream. Someone was fucking with us. Someone was playing recorded screams and laughing at our reaction. The fear I'd been feeling transformed into anger. Ben was pissed too. He stood up and shouted into the darkness, calling whoever it was a coward and telling them to show themselves if they had something to say. The only response was another scream, this time so close it sounded like it came from just beyond our circle of firelight. Then the laughter again, multiple voices now. Men laughing like this was the funniest thing they'd ever experienced. We could hear them moving through the brush, not trying to be quiet anymore, branches cracking and leaves rustling as they repositioned around us. My anger evaporated back into fear. This wasn't just a prank. This was multiple people surrounding us, coordinating their movements using fear as a weapon. We were outnumbered and isolated. Ben grabbed the largest log from our fire pile, holding it like a club. I grabbed our camping axe, the small one we'd been using to chop kindling. We stood with our backs to the fire, facing outward, waiting for whoever was out there to make their move. The laughter stopped. The screaming stopped. Everything went silent except for the crackling of our fire and our own heavy breathing. Then we saw the first flashlight, a beam cutting through the trees to our left, moving slowly toward us. Then another to our right, then one behind us. At least 3 people, maybe more, approaching our campsite from different directions with lights off until now. Ben shouted that we'd called the Rangers and they were on their way. One of the lights stopped, and a voice called out asking if we were having fun yet. The voice was mocking, amused, completely unconcerned about the threat of Rangers. The lights got closer, and I could start to make out figures behind them. Men, at least 3 that I could see, all wearing dark clothing. They stopped at the edge of our firelight, just far enough away that we couldn't see their faces clearly. One of them said they owned these woods, that we were trespassing on their property even though we knew this was national forest land. He said there was a toll for camping here, and if we wanted to leave safely, we'd need to pay it. Ben told them to fuck off, that this was public land and we weren't giving them anything. The man laughed and said we'd misunderstood. The toll wasn't money. They wanted our gear, our food, anything valuable we had. And if we didn't hand it over peacefully, they'd take it anyway along with whatever else they wanted to take. The threat in his voice was unmistakable. We were in an impossible situation. 3 or more men, possibly armed, demanding we give them everything while we stood there with a log and a small axe. If we fought, we'd lose. If we ran, we'd be stumbling through dark forest while they hunted us. If we complied, we'd be left with nothing, miles from help. Ben must have been thinking the same thing because he asked how we knew they'd let us go after we gave them what they wanted. The man said we didn't know, that we'd just have to trust them. Then he and the other figures started walking into our camp, their lights now pointing directly at our faces, blinding us. I tightened my grip on the axe and prepared to swing at whoever got close enough. But before anyone reached us, we heard sirens. Distant but getting louder. Multiple vehicles coming down the forest roads toward our area. The men immediately turned and ran, their flashlights bouncing wildly as they crashed through the underbrush. Within seconds, they were gone, swallowed by the darkness. Ben and I stood there shaking, still holding our makeshift weapons, unable to process what had just happened. The sirens got louder, and soon we saw lights coming down the trail toward our site. 2 Rangers on ATVs, both of them armed, arrived and found us standing by our fire looking like we'd seen ghosts. We told them everything, the screaming, the laughter, the men demanding our gear. The Rangers radioed for backup and started searching the area with thermal imaging equipment. They found evidence of several people having been in the woods around our site, footprints and broken branches, but no sign of the men themselves. They had disappeared completely. One of the Rangers told us this wasn't the first report they'd received. Over the past 6 months, there had been at least a dozen incidents of campers being harassed in similar ways. Recorded screams played to frighten people, groups of men surrounding campsites and demanding valuables, threats of violence if the campers didn't comply. Some people had been robbed, others had been assaulted. The Rangers believed it was a loose organization of local criminals who had figured out that isolated campers made easy targets and were unlikely to fight back effectively. They offered to escort us out immediately or to stay with us for the rest of the night if we wanted to remain. We chose to leave. We packed our gear in record time and followed the Rangers back to the main campground where there were other people and lights and a sense of safety. We slept in Ben's car in the parking lot that night, too shaken to set up a tent even in the developed area. The next morning we drove home, cutting our trip short by 2 days. We never found out if the men were caught, but I doubt they were. People like that know the forest better than any ranger. They know where to hide and when to scatter. They're probably still out there, playing their recorded screams surrounding frightened campers, taking what they want from people who are too isolated to get help quickly. Ben and I haven't gone camping together since. We talk about it sometimes, say we should try again, but neither of us has actually followed through. The truth is that night changed how we see camping. It's not peaceful anymore, not relaxing. It's vulnerable. It's putting yourself in a position where you're miles from help, where criminals know you probably have expensive gear and no way to defend it. I used to think the greatest dangers in the wilderness were natural things, weather or wildlife or getting lost. Now I know the real danger is other humans who have decided that might makes right and isolated campers are fair game. Story 7. The Abandoned Mine. My friends Eric, Taylor, and I planned a camping trip in the San Juan Mountains of Colorado for mid-September. We were all experienced backpackers in our late 20s, and we wanted a challenge, so we chose a route that would take us through some of the more remote areas of the range. The plan was to hike for 4 days, covering about 40 miles total, camping at different spots each night. On our second day, we veered slightly off the main trail to investigate what looked like old mining equipment in the distance. The area was dotted with abandoned mines from the late 1800s gold rush, and we thought it would be cool to explore. We found a partially collapsed entrance to a mine shaft, the wooden support beams rotting but still visible. Signs posted nearby warned people to stay out, that abandoned mines were dangerous and unstable. Of course, we ignored the signs. Eric was particularly excited, taking photos of the entrance and peering into the darkness. He could see that the shaft extended pretty far back, maybe 50 or 60 feet, before the collapse blocked further access. Taylor dared him to go inside just a little ways, and Eric, never one to back down from a dare, started walking into the mine with his flashlight. He made it maybe 20 feet in when he stopped abruptly and said, "There's someone in here." Taylor and I thought he was joking, but his voice had this edge of genuine fear that made us move closer to the entrance. Eric came walking back out quickly, his flashlight beam shaking, and said there was a person sitting against the back wall of the mine, in the darkest part where the collapse blocked the shaft. We all shined our lights into the mine, and Eric was right. There was a figure sitting there, motionless, in what looked like old, tattered clothing. We called out asking if they needed help, if they were okay. No response. The figure didn't move at all. Taylor said it was probably a homeless person sheltering in the mine, and we should leave them alone. But something about the complete stillness bothered me. People breathe, they move slightly, they react to voices and lights. This person did nothing. Eric grabbed a small rock and tossed it gently toward the figure, trying to get a reaction. The rock hit the ground near them and the figure didn't respond. We moved closer to the mine entrance, trying to get a better look. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness and my flashlight focused, I realized why the person wasn't moving. It wasn't a person. It was a body, a corpse, mummified by the dry air of the mine, sitting in a position that suggested they had simply sat down and died there, probably decades ago. All three of us backed away from the mine entrance immediately. Taylor actually started gagging, the realization of what we'd been looking at making her physically ill. We moved away from the site and called 911, reporting what we'd found. The dispatcher took our information and said she'd send Forest Service personnel to investigate, but that it might take several hours for anyone to reach the remote location. She advised us to stay in the area if we felt safe doing so, to serve as guides when the authorities arrived. We decided to wait, setting up our tents about 100 yards from the mine entrance, far enough away that we couldn't see it, but close enough to point investigators in the right direction when they arrived. As we waited, we started talking about who the person might have been. A miner who got trapped during the collapse? A homeless person who crawled in there to die in peace? Someone who got lost and took shelter in the wrong place? We were speculating, trying to make sense of what we'd seen, when Eric said something that shut all of us up. He said the corpse had been wearing modern clothing. Not miners' clothes from the 1800s, but modern jeans and a jacket. The body might have been mummified, but the clothes weren't century-old. Whoever that person was, they had died relatively recently, maybe within the past few years. That changed everything. This wasn't a historical discovery. This was potentially a crime scene. Someone had died in that mine, alone and isolated, and their body had been sitting there undiscovered while the elements preserved it. Taylor said we should move farther away, that if this was a crime scene, there might be a reason nobody had found the body yet. Maybe someone didn't want it found. We were packing up to relocate when we heard an engine approaching. An ATV coming up the trail from the direction we'd hiked earlier. We assumed it was Forest Service rangers arriving to investigate, earlier than expected. But the person who pulled up wasn't wearing a uniform. He was a middle-aged man in regular clothes, and he immediately asked what we were doing in this area. His tone was aggressive, not friendly or concerned. Eric explained that we were hiking and waiting for rangers to arrive because we'd found something in the mine. The man's expression changed, his eyes darting toward the mine entrance, then back to us. He asked what we'd found, and when Eric told him about the body, the man's jaw clenched. He said we needed to leave immediately, that this was private property even though we knew it was national forest. He said if we didn't leave right now, there would be problems. We were outnumbered, 1 man against 3 of us, but something about his demeanor made us believe the threat was real. He wasn't bluffing, and worse, his reaction suggested he knew about the body in the mine. Maybe he knew who it was, maybe he knew how they died. Maybe he was the reason they died. We started backing away, gathering our gear, keeping our eyes on him. He stayed mounted on his ATV, watching us, waiting for us to leave. Eric tried to stall, saying we needed to wait for the rangers, that we'd already called 911 and given our location. The man said that was unfortunate, that we'd made a mistake getting involved in something that wasn't our business. Then he pulled a rifle from a scabbard attached to the ATV and laid it across his lap. Not pointing it at us, just a clear demonstration that he was armed and we were not. We left. We grabbed our packs and started hiking away as quickly as we could without running. The man stayed at the mine site watching us go, the rifle still across his lap. We hiked for about 2 miles before we stopped to catch our breath and figure out what to do. Eric called 911 again and reported the encounter, describing the man and his ATV, explaining that we'd been threatened and forced to leave. The dispatcher said rangers were en route to the mine location and would be there within the hour. She advised us to continue hiking toward the trailhead and meet with law enforcement there. We did exactly that, hiking at double speed, constantly looking behind us to make sure the man on the ATV wasn't following. We reached the trailhead 3 hours later and found multiple law enforcement vehicles waiting. Sheriff's deputies, Forest Service rangers, and what looked like investigators from the state police. We gave detailed statements about what we'd found in the mine and described the man who had threatened us. The investigators said they'd found the mine and the body, but by the time they arrived, the man on the ATV was gone. Over the next few weeks, we learned bits and pieces of the story through news reports and follow-up calls from investigators. The body in the mine was identified as a woman who had gone missing 2 years prior while hiking in the area. She'd been reported missing by her family, and search efforts had turned up nothing. The official assumption had been that she got lost and died of exposure somewhere in the vast wilderness. But the location of her body and the circumstances suggested something different. She was sitting upright against the back wall of the mine, hands positioned in her lap, not in a natural position for someone who had collapsed or succumbed to exposure. Investigators believed she had been killed elsewhere and her body placed in the mine as a hiding spot, somewhere it might never be found if not for hikers ignoring warning signs and exploring abandoned shafts. The man on the ATV was never identified or caught. His description matched no known residents of the area, and his ATV had no distinguishing features that would make it traceable. Whoever he was, he knew about the body in the mine. He might have been the killer, or he might have been protecting the killer, or he might have been involved in some other way. The case is still open, still unsolved. Eric, Taylor, and I testified at various hearings and depositions related to the case. It consumed months of our lives, turning what was supposed to be a fun camping trip into a nightmare of legal proceedings and media attention. Local news covered the story extensively, and we were portrayed as heroes for finding the body, but we didn't feel heroic. We felt traumatized and guilty. Guilty that we'd ignored safety signs to explore the mine. Guilty that our curiosity had led us to discover something so horrible. Guilty that we'd left when the man threatened us instead of standing our ground. The investigators assured us we did the right thing by leaving. If the man was connected to the murder, confronting him could have ended with 3 more bodies in that mine. But the guilt remains, and the image of that corpse sitting in the darkness, preserved by the dry mountain air, waiting to be found, haunts all 3 of us. We don't go hiking together anymore. Too many bad memories associated with those mountains and what we found there. Story 8. The Midnight Visitor. I went on a solo camping trip in the White Mountain National Forest in New Hampshire, my first time camping completely alone. I was 31. Recently single after a long relationship, and I wanted to prove to myself that I could be independent and self-sufficient. I chose a popular trail with well-established campsites, figuring that even though I'd be alone, there would be other campers nearby if I needed help. I hiked 4 miles to a campsite that the trail map indicated had space for multiple tents and a good water source. When I arrived in the late afternoon, I was pleased to find I was the only person there. The site had a fire ring, a flat area for tents, and a small stream running nearby. Perfect. I set up my tent, gathered firewood, and cooked dinner as the sun set. I felt proud of myself, confident, enjoying the solitude. As darkness fell, the forest around me came alive with sounds. Owls hooting, small animals rustling in the underbrush, wind moving through the trees. I sat by my fire reading a book, sipping whiskey from a flask, feeling like I was exactly where I needed to be. Around 10 p.m., I heard voices on the trail, other hikers approaching. I called out a friendly hello, and 2 beams from headlamps turned toward my camp. A man and a woman emerged from the trail, both wearing backpacks, both looking tired. They asked if the campsite had room for another tent, and I said absolutely, there was plenty of space. They introduced themselves as Dave and Laura, a couple from Boston doing a multi-day hike through the Whites. They seemed nice, normal, and I was actually happy to have company. We chatted while they set up their tent on the opposite side of the fire ring from mine, sharing trail stories and complaining about the black flies. We all turned in around 11, saying goodnight and agreeing to an early start in the morning since we were hiking in the same direction for the next few miles. I climbed into my sleeping bag feeling content, the sounds of Dave and Laura settling into their tent reassuring. I wasn't completely alone anymore. I woke up around 2 a.m. needing to pee. I unzipped my tent quietly, trying not to disturb Dave and Laura, and walked a short distance from camp to take care of business. As I was walking back to my tent, I noticed something that made me stop cold. There were 3 tents in the campsite. Mine, Dave and Laura's, and a third tent that definitely hadn't been there when I went to sleep. It was set up on the far side of the clearing, partially hidden by some bushes, dark green and low profile. I stood there confused, trying to make sense of it. Had another hiker arrived after we'd all gone to sleep and set up without announcing themselves? That seemed incredibly rude and weird, but maybe they didn't want to wake us. I walked closer to the mystery tent, intending to see if I could figure out who it belonged to. As I approached, I realized the tent was partially unzipped. I could see inside with my flashlight. There was no sleeping bag, no gear, nothing inside the tent at all. It was completely empty, just an empty tent set up in the middle of the night for no apparent reason. I backed away slowly, my heart starting to race. This didn't make sense. Who sets up an empty tent at 2 a.m. in a campsite where people are sleeping? I heard a branch crack behind me and spun around. A figure was standing at the edge of the clearing, just outside the reach of my flashlight beam. Tall, wearing dark clothing, watching me. I called out, "Hello?" but got no response. The figure just stood there, motionless. I raised my flashlight higher, trying to get a better look, and the figure stepped back into the trees, disappearing from sight. I ran to Dave and Laura's tent and quietly called their names, tapping on the fabric. Laura unzipped the door, looking groggy and confused. I whispered that there was someone else in the camp, that someone had set up an empty tent and was watching us from the trees. Dave and Laura both came out, and I showed them the mystery tent. Dave walked over to it, shined his flashlight inside, and confirmed it was empty. He called out into the darkness asking if anyone was there, if someone needed help. No response. We stood there together, 3 people in our pajamas in the middle of the night, staring at an empty tent that shouldn't exist. Dave suggested maybe it was left behind by previous campers, that we just hadn't noticed it earlier when we arrived. But I knew that wasn't true. I had walked around the entire campsite before setting up my tent. There had been no other tent then. Laura said we should all go back to sleep and deal with it in the morning. She was clearly uncomfortable but trying to stay rational. We agreed, but none of us really wanted to go back to our individual tents. There was safety in numbers. Dave said we should at least check our surroundings, make sure whoever had been watching me was gone. We walked the perimeter of the campsite with our flashlights, staying close together. We found footprints in the soft dirt near the tree line, boot prints that circled the entire campsite. Multiple circuits, like someone had been walking around and around our tents while we slept. The prints led away from the camp, back toward the trail, and disappeared where the ground became too rocky to hold impressions. None of us slept the rest of that night. We sat around the dead fire pit, lights on, taking turns keeping watch until sunrise. When it was finally light enough to see clearly, we examined the mystery tent more closely. It was an old model, probably 20 years old based on the style, with tears in the fabric and broken poles. It looked like something pulled from a garbage pile, something that shouldn't even be functional enough to stand up properly. And yet someone had set it up in our campsite in the middle of the night, someone who had then circled our sleeping tents multiple times. We packed up and left as soon as possible. Dave and Laura were experienced hikers, and they were as spooked as I was. We hiked out together, constantly looking behind us, expecting to see someone following. At the trailhead, we reported the incident to the ranger station. The ranger we spoke to took notes but didn't seem particularly surprised. He said there had been reports of strange activity in that area for years. Empty tents appearing overnight, campers reporting feeling watched, supplies going missing from sites. They suspected someone, possibly mentally ill or living off-grid, was watching hikers and messing with them, but they'd never been able to catch whoever it was. The ranger's casual attitude about it was almost more disturbing than the experience itself. Like this was just a known hazard of camping in that area, something to be expected and tolerated rather than investigated seriously. I never went camping alone again. The sense of vulnerability I felt that night, knowing someone was walking around my tent while I slept, knowing they set up that empty tent as some kind of message or threat or game, it destroyed my confidence in my ability to be safe in the wilderness alone. I still wonder what would have happened if I hadn't woken up to pee, if I hadn't discovered the tent and the figure watching from the trees. Would the person have escalated? Would they have done something more direct, more dangerous? Or was the entire point just psychological terror, just showing that they could access our space without us knowing, that we were vulnerable even when we thought we were safe? I don't know, and I'm grateful I don't have to know because I'll never put myself in that position again. Story 9. The Last Night. My boyfriend Chris and I went camping in the Ozark National Forest in Arkansas for our 5-year anniversary. We wanted something special and romantic, so we splurged on permits for a backcountry site that was supposed to be one of the most beautiful in the forest, perched on a bluff overlooking a valley. We hiked in on a gorgeous October afternoon, the fall colors at their peak, and found the site exactly as described. Stunning views, total privacy, perfect weather. We set up our tent right at the edge of the bluff, positioned so we could lie in our sleeping bags and watch the stars through the mesh roof. We cooked an elaborate dinner on our camp stove, drank wine we'd carried in, and watched the sunset paint the valley below in shades of orange and purple. It was perfect, the kind of experience you remember forever, the kind that makes you feel lucky to be alive and in love. As full darkness settled in, we noticed campfires in the valley below. Tiny orange dots scattered across the landscape, other campers at various sites throughout the forest. We counted them, finding 7 separate fires visible from our vantage point. Chris made a joke about how we probably looked the same to them, just another little dot of light in the darkness. We sat by our own fire talking about the future, making plans, feeling close and connected. Around 11 p.m., Chris pointed out that several of the fires we'd been watching had gone out. Only 3 were still visible. Made sense, people going to bed. But as we watched, those 3 fires went out too, all within a few minutes of each other. Then it was just us, just our fire still burning in all that darkness. It felt isolating suddenly, like the whole forest had gone to sleep except for us. We were getting ready to turn in ourselves when Chris noticed something odd. There was a light moving through the valley, a flashlight or headlamp bobbing up and down as someone hiked. But they weren't on a trail. They were moving cross-country, through dense forest, heading directly toward the bluff where we were camped. Chris said it was probably just someone hiking to a late-night campsite, but there were no other legal campsites in the direction they were moving. Just our bluff. We watched the light climb up the hillside toward us. It took almost an hour, steady progress, never deviating from a straight line toward our location. As it got closer, we could make out that it was definitely a person, just one person, hiking alone in the dark with no obvious destination except us. Chris called out when the figure was about 50 yards away, asking if they needed help or were lost. The light stopped moving. The person stood there in the darkness below our bluff, not responding to Chris's question. We called out again, asking if everything was okay. Still no response. The person just stood there, their light pointed up at us, for what felt like forever but was probably only 2 or 3 minutes. Then the light turned off. Complete darkness. Chris and I looked at each other, both of us freaked out now. Was the person still standing there in the dark? Had they left? Why would they hike all the way up here, specifically toward our campsite, and then just stand there silently? We decided to retreat into our tent, lock ourselves in as much as you can lock a tent, and wait to see what happened. We turned off our headlamps and sat in darkness inside the tent, listening. For about 10 minutes, nothing. Then we heard footsteps. Someone was climbing up the last section of bluff toward our campsite. Slow, careful footsteps on rocky terrain. They reached the top and stopped. We could hear breathing heavy from the climb. Chris whispered to me to call 911, but when I pulled out my phone, there was no service. We were too remote, too high up. The footsteps started moving again, walking around the perimeter of our campsite, staying just outside the glow of our dying fire, circling us. We sat frozen in the tent, holding each other, trying to be silent. The footsteps completed one full circle, then started a second. This time they moved closer to our tent, close enough that we could hear fabric rustling, like the person was wearing nylon pants or a jacket. Chris had packed a flare gun, something his dad had insisted he bring for emergencies. He pulled it out now and held it ready, his hands shaking. The footsteps stopped right outside our tent door. We could see a shadow through the fabric, a person standing there inches away. Then we heard a man's voice, asking if we were awake. Chris didn't respond. Neither did I. We just sat there frozen, hoping he would think we were sleeping and leave us alone. But he asked again, louder this time, saying he knew we were awake because he'd seen our lights on just a few minutes ago. He said he'd been watching us all evening from down in the valley, watching our fire, and he'd decided to come visit because he was lonely. The way he said lonely made my skin crawl. It wasn't friendly or casual. It was threatening, possessive. Chris finally responded, his voice stronger than I expected, telling the man to leave our campsite, that we didn't want visitors. The man laughed. He said this was his forest, his bluff, and we were the visitors. He said he came up here often and he'd never seen anyone at this campsite before, that we must be special to have found it. He started walking around the tent again, trailing his hand along the fabric as he moved. We could see his fingers dragging across the material, hear the nylon rustling. He was testing us, pushing boundaries, seeing how we would react. Chris raised the flare gun and fired it through the tent roof. A bright red emergency flare that shot into the sky with a loud bang and lit up the entire area like daylight. In that brief moment of illumination, we saw him. A man in his 40s or 50s, dirty clothing, matted beard, carrying a large hunting knife in his belt. He looked up at the flare with an expression that was more annoyed than scared, like we'd inconvenienced him with our attempt to get help. Then the flare started falling back to earth and darkness returned. The man didn't leave. He said that was a stupid thing to do, that nobody could see the flare from here except maybe the people in the valley, and they were all asleep. He was right. We were completely isolated. Chris had one more flare, but we couldn't waste it. We needed to save it for when it might actually help. The man started pushing against the tent, testing the poles, seeing how stable it was. Chris yelled at him to stop, that we'd defend ourselves if he didn't leave. The man laughed again and said we should prove it. Then he grabbed one of the tent poles from outside and pulled it, partially collapsing our shelter. The fabric fell on top of us and we scrambled to get out, not wanting to be trapped inside. We emerged from the collapsed tent and Chris immediately pointed the flare gun at the man, who was standing about 10 feet away with that knife now in his hand. The man said, "Go ahead, fire the last flare," and then what? We'd be in darkness with no shelter and no protection. He had all the advantages. He knew this forest, he'd done this before, and he had all night to do whatever he wanted to us. Chris's hand was shaking so badly I thought he might drop the gun. I looked around desperately for anything we could use as a weapon. Our camp stove, a cooking pot, a collapsible water container. Nothing useful. The man started walking toward us. Slowly, confidently, knife held low. He said we should have been more careful about where we chose to camp, that isolated places attract isolated people. That's when we heard the helicopter. Distant at first but getting louder quickly. Someone had seen the flare. A Forest Service helicopter doing night patrols, or maybe a local pilot who happened to be in the air. The man heard it too, and his confident expression changed to concern. He looked up at the sky, then back at us, calculating his options. The helicopter was getting closer, the sound of rotor blades echoing through the valley. The man ran. He grabbed his flashlight from wherever he'd set it down and took off running back the way he'd come, scrambling down the bluff at a reckless speed. We heard him crashing through brush, his light bouncing wildly as he fled. The helicopter appeared over the valley, a spotlight sweeping back and forth, searching. They'd definitely seen the flare. The helicopter circled our area for about 10 minutes while Chris and I waved our flashlights and shouted, trying to signal our location. Eventually the spotlight found us, and a voice over a loudspeaker asked if we needed assistance. Chris shouted yes, that someone had attacked us, that we needed help. The helicopter couldn't land on the bluff, but they said they would radio for ground assistance and would stay in the area until help arrived. 2 Forest Service rangers reached us on foot about an hour later. We told them everything, described the man, showed them our collapsed tent and the footprints around our campsite. They said they'd had reports about a man living illegally in this section of the forest, someone who'd been seen watching campgrounds and following hikers. They'd been trying to locate him for months, but he knew the terrain too well and always managed to disappear before they could catch him. One of the rangers said we were lucky. 6 months ago, a solo female hiker had been attacked in this same area. She survived but was seriously injured, and she described her attacker in terms that matched the man we'd seen. The rangers believed he'd been escalating, getting bolder, choosing more isolated victims. If the helicopter hadn't shown up when it did, they didn't say what might have happened to us, but their expressions made it clear. We hiked out that night with the rangers, abandoning most of our gear because we just wanted to get away from that bluff. Our anniversary trip, our romantic getaway, turned into a nightmare that neither of us has fully processed even years later. Chris and I did eventually get married, but we didn't go camping for our honeymoon. We went to a hotel in a city, surrounded by people, with locks on the doors and security in the lobby. The man from the bluff was never caught. The rangers increased patrols in that area and closed several backcountry campsites. But the forest is vast, and someone determined to stay hidden can do it indefinitely. Every few months, we checked the news from Arkansas, looking for updates, hoping to see that he was finally arrested. So far, nothing. He's still out there, somewhere in those mountains, watching campfires in the valleys below, choosing his next victims. Finally, the wilderness will always have its dangers. But these 9 stories remind us that sometimes the most terrifying thing you can encounter isn't what's in the forest naturally. It's what or who has chosen to hide there. Stay alert when you camp, trust your instincts when something feels wrong, and remember that not everyone who walks through those dark woods has good intentions. The trees may be silent, but they see everything, and they never warn you before something steps out from between them. Sweet dreams, campers.